Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we take a closer look at the week's top political stories. Ballotpedia connects people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. We're here to give you the facts so you can form your own opinion. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for being with us. Today, we're bringing you everything you need to know about the school board primaries that just took place in Oklahoma, as well as results in the Wisconsin Supreme Court primary that just took place on February 21st. Here to help us break it down is our very own Doug Kreneisel.
Hello, Victoria. How are you?
I'm well. How are you? Good to have you back.
Yeah, it's good to be back. We're getting into the election cycle. Fun stuff happening at the ballot box.
Yeah, even in an odd year. The last time you were on the show, you mentioned you had a new cat. How's your cat doing?
She's assimilating well. We're assimilating to her bursts of manic energy at like 6 a.m. on the dot every day. But, keeps
like
us lively. Exactly. Yeah. They're just fuzzier and smaller.
So, Doug, this is a brand new initiative at Ballotpedia that we're talking about today, where we're hoping to cover every school board election in 10 states these next few months. Can you tell us a little bit more about this initiative, our methodology, and what our goals are, as well as how we decided on these 10 states to start with?
Like you mentioned, we're taking an extra deep dive into the down ballot local elections in 10 states: Colorado, Kansas, Minnesota, Ohio, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, South Dakota, my home state, Virginia, Washington, and Wisconsin. While odd years get a rap as being quote unquote boring in terms of elections, they are actually a perfect time to dive into these local elections. States like Colorado, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, they hold just about all of their school board elections in odd years, for example. But as our listeners know, at Ballotpedia, we want to give voters as much information as possible so they can feel confident when it comes time to cast a ballot. We hear a lot about Senate races and governors and state legislatures, but these local elections, like those for school boards, are some of the most consequential in our day-to-day lives, but they often get the least amount of attention. So we're hoping that this effort will help fill in those gaps a bit, give people an even better idea of who's on their ballot and, by extension, who they want to vote for.
Definitely. And these races represent hundreds, if not thousands, of candidates. You talked about helping voters decide who they want to choose to be on their school board. How exactly are we going to do that? We obviously will have the names, but usually people see a party affiliation along with that name, and it kind of gives them an idea of what sort of policies they're for. But with school boards, those races are often nonpartisan. So what sort of information are we hoping to provide voters to help them make a decision?
That's a great question, and one that I'm really excited to be working on to answer, and one that I'm sure we'll talk about later on in the year. But you're correct. Just seeing a name on our website doesn't tell you much. But we're working on ways to get more helpful, descriptive information out there too. One big one is our candidate connection survey. Obviously, once these candidates have a page on our website, they are free to submit a survey, which will appear on their page. We've talked about the survey before, but it's just a really helpful tool for candidates to share who they are, why they're running, and what they would do if elected. So, quick call to action, listeners. If you go to a candidate's page, there's usually a link to send them an email or tweet asking them to submit a survey if they haven't already. And we found that hearing from your constituents or your prospective constituents can be a helpful boost to get that survey submitted. Another thing that we're focusing on with school boards in particular are endorsements. If a candidate receives an endorsement, we want to get it up on their page because who endorses you, especially in a nonpartisan race, can say a lot. Did the candidate receive an endorsement from the local teachers union, the county Republican Party, a state legislator, some other organization focused on school boards? These can all help voters understand what the candidate stands for. Similar to our surveys, if a reader or any listeners come across an endorsement, they can also share those with us and we'll try to get them processed.
Well, we're going to dive right into these results from this Oklahoma school board election that happened on February 14th. Could you give us a bird's eye view of Oklahoma school board landscape?
Yeah, let's start with some of the basics. Oklahoma has 512 school districts. There are approximately 4.5 school board members per district. And across the state, men make up 64% of all board members and women make up 32%. We couldn't identify a gender for the remaining 5%. So that's your kind of lay of the land, what these boards look like and how many there are in the state, but they vary in size quite a bit. The two biggest school districts in the state, Oklahoma City Public Schools and Tulsa Public Schools, have over 35,000 students each. And then there are 6 districts with less than 50 students, including White Oaks Public Schools with an enrollment of just 32 students.
Oh, wow. That's a big difference. How do Oklahoma school board elections actually work, though? And what's at stake in these primaries?
Each of Oklahoma's school boards holds elections annually. Every district has at least one seat up for election this year. Some districts might have more if they're a special election. So there's a lot of activity across the state. It's important to note that Oklahoma's school board elections are, like we mentioned earlier, nonpartisan, meaning every candidate appears on the same ballot without party labels. As far as timing goes and how these elections works, the general election is on April 4th. But like you said, what happened on February 14th, that was a primary. A few districts held primaries in places where more than two candidates were running. In Oklahoma, in these primaries in particular, if a candidate receives more than 50% of the vote in that primary, they just win outright. There's no general election in April. They are going to be the new school board members. Otherwise, the top two vote getters will advance to that general election on April 4th. Statewide, there are 733 candidates filed to run for 488 districts. And actually, there were 24 districts where no candidates filed to run. In these districts, the local school board has 60 days from the election date to appoint a new member or call a special election.
That sparks my next question. Even if we're seeing a lot of elevated action in school board politics nationally, there's not a lot of competition in these races, right?
That's definitely the case in Oklahoma, at least what we've noticed this year. There are 405 offices. That's 70% of all of them up for election, where only one candidate is running. In those instances, the primary is canceled, the general election is canceled, that person just wins. They just are going to be on the school board. One person filed, automatic win. In another 123 offices, so 21%, there were two candidates running. These didn't hold the primary because they didn't have to, and so they will be taking place in April, as well as the 23 offices that held primaries last week on the 14th, which amounts to just 5% of all of those up for election.
And how did those primaries play out? I'm not going to have you butcher any Oklahomans' last names, but just a big picture of how those contested primaries played out.
14 races were decided outright, meaning one candidate received more than 50% of the vote, canceling that April election. 9, though, will advance to the April general election with the top two vote getters after no candidate received more than 50% of the vote. There was one that was particularly close in El Reno Public Schools that's just in the vicinity of Oklahoma City. In that race, Eric Palmer, a customer service manager at a wood finishing company, he got the first place, 37% of the vote going to April, and he'll be joined by Ronald Funk, a former county assessor, who advanced to the general election by the narrowest of margins. Funk received 138 votes, one more than the third place finisher, incumbent Roberta Hamilton, who was appointed to fill the vacancy on the board last year. 10 of the seats overall of those primaries that were happening were open, meaning there weren't any incumbents. And then of those, 4 were decided outright. 6 advanced to the general election.
Something we're always interested here at Ballotpedia is how incumbents fare in these races. So how did incumbent school board members fare in the Oklahoma primaries?
13 incumbents were on the ballot. 9 of those incumbents, they either won outright or advanced to the general election, but 4 incumbents lost. So we had Hamilton in El Reno, but in addition to her, we had Tom Ketchum at Alex Public Schools, Brett Drum in Chateau Maisie Public Schools, and Philip McGee at Gore Public Schools. And Ketchum and Drum, they were actually school board presidents. And now they won't be. They lost.
Really interesting. Do you know how this rate of incumbents winning or losing corresponds to other states? Is this generally how the rate plays out?
So the difficult thing with this is just that the sample size was so small that like 4 losses is, 33% or something like that. But, if we are just looking at percentage rates, 30%, that's pretty high compared to what we're used to seeing in our in-scope races. So our in-scope races are the largest school districts nationwide. And in those, each year, the incumbent loss rate is somewhere between 16 to 20%. And so with this right here, with just this little sample in the primary, it's around 30%. So a little bit higher than what we're used to seeing.
Looking to Wisconsin, who held their primaries just yesterday. We're recording this episode on Wednesday, the 22nd. So the results haven't yet been finalized. But for now, what's the school board landscape look like in America's Dairyland?
There are 423 school districts across Wisconsin, but kind of similar to Oklahoma, only a handful, I think like 27 of those districts actually held primaries. And then, similarly, we're going to have a general election later on in the year where most of the activity will be happening. Unlike Oklahoma, candidates don't win outright in Wisconsin. It's just whoever gets the top 2 votes goes to the general election. You don't have anybody winning outright. These districts also range in size. We had seats in the Madison Metropolitan School District, which has nearly 27,000 school students. Milwaukee Public Schools, which has over 75,000 students.
Got it. We're looking forward to getting those results later this year. And before I let you go, Doug, Wisconsin had another primary yesterday, this one to fill a vacancy on their state Supreme Court that was created by Justice Patience Roggensack's retirement. Wisconsin Supreme Court elections are officially nonpartisan, but the court is considered to have a 4-3 conservative majority. With Roggensack, a member of the court's conservative majority, retiring, this election will determine the ideological control of that court. So which 2 candidates will be advancing to the general election in April, Doug?
Janet Protasiewicz and Daniel Kelly advanced from the nonpartisan primary for Wisconsin Supreme Court. Defeating Jennifer Darrow and Everett Mitchell were the other candidates running. This general election is going to be taking place on April 4th. Protasiewicz is the Liberal candidate. She was first elected to the Milwaukee County Circuit Court in 2014. She received 46% of the overall vote in the primary. Kelly, who is conservative leaning, he previously served on the Supreme Court from 2016 when he was appointed by former Governor Scott Walker to 2020. Kelly won 24%, but we should note that the conservative vote was likely split between Kelly and Jennifer Darrow, who received 22% of the vote. So if you take those 2 conservative candidates, smash their vote totals together, it's pretty similar to what Protasiewicz had as well. So it will be a close race in April. But, like you were saying, this has kind of been a long time coming down the pike. The stakes in this election, Kelly was on the board, like we mentioned, until 2020 when he had to stand for election. And he actually lost in 2020. And at that point in time, the conservative majority was 5-2 or something like that. Yeah, it must have been 5-2 because the whole idea was if Kelly doesn't win in 2020, then when 2023 rolls around, the ideological majority of the board will be at stake. And so we've kind of been following this for a while, getting to this point. Going to be a really interesting race come April.
Yeah, for sure. That's really interesting context. I'd like to thank you for coming on and breaking all this down for us. But more importantly, I look forward to having you back to cover the next set of election results.
Oh, and I am looking forward to it as well. It should be a good one.
It's your boy, Pauly Politics, with another edition of Footnote Facts. We're in the thick of the U.S. Supreme Court term for 2022 to 2023, and with recent major events like the overturning of Roe v. Wade, along with upcoming cases such as what Mij discussed with Victoria in the last episode, SCOTUS reversals of lower court decisions makes for a relevant and interesting topic for this week. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to answer this trivia question. From 2007 to 2022, what year saw the highest SCOTUS reversal rate of lower court decisions? Now, because the U.S. Supreme Court is the highest court in the country and the final arbiter of U.S. Constitution interpretations, it is extremely difficult to get a case to be heard by that court. In fact, only about 1% of the thousands of cases petitioned to SCOTUS are actually heard by the court. And virtually all the cases are appellate in nature, as from 2007 to 2022, only 11 of 1,128 decisions SCOTUS made were in its original jurisdiction. But beyond that, SCOTUS cases are about a lower court's decision already made in that case. But as hard as it is to be heard by SCOTUS, when a case does reach them, there's a pretty good chance that the lower court decision will be reversed. In that 2007 to 2022 period, 805 of those 1,128, or 71.4%, lower court rulings were reversed by SCOTUS. And with the exception of the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, of which the SCOTUS has only heard about 3 cases in that 15-year time frame, every category of lower court has had over half of their rulings turned around by SCOTUS. And these lower court categories are for the 11 numbered circuits, the D.C. Circuit, Federal Circuit, U.S. District Courts, state courts, and the aforementioned Court for the Armed Forces. Forces. That's a mouthful. And even though all of those courts, except for the Armed Forces, had an over 50% overruling rate by SCOTUS, some seem much more reversals than others. The lowest rate was the Fourth Circuit Court, which covers the Carolinas, Virginias, and Maryland, and that was 32 of 54 rulings, 59.3%, reversed by SCOTUS from 2007 to 2022. On the other end, highest rate was in the Sixth Circuit, which is Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee, with 66 of 81 rulings, or 81.5%, overturned by SCOTUS. But in terms of sheer volume, cases from the Ninth Circuit, geographically the largest circuit, and state courts were by far the cases heard most often by the U.S. Supreme Court. From 2007 to 2022, for the Ninth Circuit, 176 of 219 rulings, 80.4%, were overturned by the highest court of the land, and for state courts, 118 of 155 rulings, 76.1%, were overturned. So if you are unhappy with a court ruling, count your lucky stars if you are in the Ninth Circuit or in state courts, because if you can be granted a writ of cert to be heard by SCOTUS, there is a really good chance you will have SCOTUS overturn the ruling in your favor, though obviously depends on other factors like what the case was about in the first place. But for what it's worth, the Ninth Circuit saw the most SCOTUS reversals of the circuit's rulings in every term of the past 15 years, except for 2007, 2015, and 2016, which is when it was state courts that saw the most reversals. And it should be noted that Supreme Court terms typically start in October and run through June, so terms are actually a part of 2 calendar years. So to top things off before going back to the trivia question, how is this year shaping up so far? Well, the number of cases argued from October 2022 to January 2023 is roughly comparable to recent years. In this SCOTUS term, through the January sitting, there have been 34 cases that were argued before the court. In the 2021 to 2022 term, it was 38 for that same time period, and for the 2020 to 2021 term, it was 33 cases. But in terms of opinions administered by the court, there have been noticeably fewer released this term compared to previous years. We've only had 2 of them from the October to January sittings of the current term. Compare that with 10 opinions released by this point in the 2020 to 2021 terms and 12 in the 2019 to 2020 terms. It's common for SCOTUS opinions to be published several months after arguments are made by plaintiffs and defendants in court, but it is a bit unusual to have this low a number of opinions published at this point in time for the current term. Certainly time for that to change through the rest of this SCOTUS term, though, so we'll see. Now back to the trivia question. Again, that was, from 2007 to 2022, what year saw the highest SCOTUS reversal rate of lower court decisions? Quite recent, in fact. The 2021 to 2022 term, the same term that saw the Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization ruling, which overturned Roe v. Wade. 54 to 66 of those cases in that year, or 81.82% that were brought to SCOTUS, overturned lower court rulings. Meanwhile, the year that saw the lowest rate in that time frame was 2011, with 47 of 75 cases, or a little over 62%, being reversals of lower court decisions, so still over half of the cases. And that's it for me. Have a great one. Now to send this back to the On the Ballot MVP, Victoria Rose.
Thanks, Paul. That's all for this week's episode of On the Ballot. Thanks again to Doug for coming on the show today. Make sure you don't miss an episode by subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be back next week with another episode. And until then, if you have any questions, comments, or love for Ballotpedia, feel free to send it to us at ontheballot@ballotpedia.org or on Twitter @Ballotpedia. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for listening.